Three little stories. One, we're all pushing our grief into shapes of joy, as Marvin indicated. Shakespeare taught us a long time ago. Marvin grasping that quality from Shakespeare and combining it to exactly what we're doing now. It's for the PhDs in the room to figure out exactly what some of the intersections are between Marvin's work and Einstein's work. But let me tell you something about Marvin's heart. He shares with Einstein's heart the aortic malfunction that killed Einstein. Einstein could have had surgery on his aorta, but chose not to, saying it would have been unnatural to live in a way that had been intervened upon by medicine. But Marvin had so much regard for his heart, and of course the technology was different and much better in his time than Einstein's time, that he chose to have a prosthetic put into his heart, at which point he joyfully said that his heart had become a robot, and it had kept him with us a few more years. We've got one more story to tell. Holly, I want you to get to the piano, all right, and think of something to play here, because this is going to be big.
Before or after the story?
After the story.
Okay.
No, but sit down at the piano. I love seeing you there. It makes the room more real. It makes it more actually real. First of all, a lot has been talked about how Marvin intimidated people as a professor, even though he had such humanistic regard for people's feelings. As a college dropout and as a father of two daughters, one of whom is an actress who loved Marvin but didn't really understand who he was in the grand scheme of things. Marvin would always tell my daughter Olivia stories. He told the story about the contrails in the sky and how jet planes were the reason why nature wanted to make pictures of bad clouds. And he said so many other things that amazed and dazzled Olivia. And she would come to me afterwards and say, I love that guy. Who is he? He's a professor at MIT? I said, yeah, he's a professor of artificial intelligence. She thought about this, and days later, she came back to me, and Marvin's name came up at some point. She said, how can his intelligence be artificial? There's no possible way. This is a story from the 1950s from Martin Shubik, the Princeton Gang. Fine hall. Burblers, tinkerers, and gamesters, Marvin Minsky, John McCarthy, Lloyd Shapley, John Nash, and many others, a perfect playpen and complete and competent support for all oblivious young egomaniacs. Possibly the item that distinguished Marvin from the rest is that although all were able to argue at length on almost anything, and word patterns and symbol descriptions flowed without ceasing, he was the only seriously major league tinkerer among us. While some of us enjoyed devising games to stress the variety and perversity of human behavior, Marvin was less interested in overall social or antisocial games than in how one could build gadgets and programs to really do things, how you could make progress in understanding the subtleties of what appeared to be simple actions in everyday life, deconstructing them, and then reconstructing them. From graduate school onwards, there was not enough time to look back. The Hydra heads kept sprouting. Every problem solved opened new vistas. Some 65 years later, unto the day he died, Marvin had all of the enthusiasms and force that he had at the start of the journey. He was doubly blessed with the love and intellectual support of his wife, Gloria, as well as his children, snakes, gerbils, cats, jukebox, stacks, books, wiring, and tool collection that took up every inch of an ancient Brookline house of some 8,000 square feet, plus the occasional dismantled car to help decorate the garden. Michael?
It's a tiny little musical invention. Marvin got a kick out of it, but sort of like the math problems that you can look at from different perspectives, this little piece does that too.
Cynthia, Brian.
Did we get our slides?
What?
Oh, there it is. Hi, I'm Brian Silverman, and this is Cynthia Solomon. We want to talk today about Marvin and Seymour, Marvin and Logo, Marvin and education. Myself, I grew up in Montreal, which back in those days was a bit of an intellectual backwater, and my family had no connection at all with anything really academic or anything like no science or engineering. And people around me, when I was getting to be of university age, said, you should go to MIT. You're doing well in math and science. And I figured, okay, good, I'm going to go to MIT. So I applied and I got in. And I get this acceptance letter and I show it to my father and he says, MIT, that's great. That's the school Marvin Minsky teaches at. I said, Marvin who? And my father said, I don't know, but he's this guy that keeps appearing in all the science fiction that I read, so he probably is interesting.
Well, I got into know Marvin a long time ago, and I wanted to learn to program. And a friend of mine said, well, this guy I know is always looking for a secretary. So that's how I hooked up with Marvin. I wanted to learn to program, and I became his secretary. And I did learn to program. And 4 years later, 1966, I was at Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, where Seymour Papert, and I've just found out Danny Barbro, who's here, Wally Feuerzweig, me and another couple of people started a programming language for children called Logo. And the interesting thing, the reason I'm talking about it is in the background was Marvin Minsky. Marvin and Seymour collaborated on everything, including thinking about children learning things and what's a good environment.
So probably worth saying one word about Seymour at the beginning of this. Seymour, at that point, the point just before Cynthia met him, was the resident mathematician at Piaget's lab. So he was kind of playing the role in an epistemology lab, trying to explain about mathematics. Marvin and Seymour famously gave the same talk at a conference and realized they should know each other, and with the help of, here you can have this, with the help of Warren McCullough got lured to MIT, which I kind of thought that there was a bit of an interesting symmetry to this, even though it wasn't in Marvin's intent. It turned out that Marvin had brought Seymour along, Marvin the mathematician had brought Seymour along to get some help with epistemology. Now, Logo is usually associated with Seymour. And one of the things that we wanted to say today is, especially in the early days, Marvin's influence and his help in a lot of ways was very important.
But this, in 1968-69, Seymour and I taught a class of 7th graders. And this is what it looked like. Those are Model 33s and Model 35 teletypes.
Usually used for printing out theses.
What? Yes, that's why I'm mentioning it. That's what we used to the computer back at BBN. After this project, I joined Seymour at MIT in the Logo group as part of the AI group started. And this is 1970. And the reason, this is when we had turtles, floor turtles, display turtles, music, animation, and it's only a year different. And one of the reasons it's so charged up is because of Marvin Minsky and the atmosphere at the AI lab. Because everybody, all the hackers and graduate students, almost all, participated. They loved Marvin, they loved Seymour, they had to be involved. And there was a lot of wonderful graphics that were done. Here is the music box that Marvin Minsky does.
And if you look carefully, it's on the shelf just beside the, I'm not even.
It's a black box.
It's a black box.
It sits on the Minsky's fireplace mantle, but it's all sort of gutted.
Put these little tunes together.
This is Seymour speaking. And this was a long time ago. Computer synthesized music was kind of not really in anybody's imagination. The music box fits in at about the time that Marvin and Ed Fredkin made the Muse. It fits a little bit after. Those of you who visited, several earlier speakers talked about living in the Minsky house. There used to be a music synthesis machine in the kitchen, and we never really figured out.
It was rack mounted.
It was rack mounted and quite impressive until somebody pulled half the wires out.
And it was orange.
And what we'd like to show next is.
Let me interrupt.
Okay.
In 1972, we wanted to get Logo and Turtles out in the world. So Marvin, Seymour, me, and a couple of other people started a company, Seymour's brother, called General Turtle. And this is what happened. Marvin decided to build, and this is where Danny was talking, build a logo machine, a turtle graphics machine. Here it is.
This machine is called the 2500, and basically it's a small, very powerful computer which has built into it hardware to run two kinds of displays. This is the central processor, which is the computer itself. This is a display which shows printed material, and you can use several kinds of fonts. In fact, you can design your own type font, and it can do a limited amount of picture displaying ability. This is called a vector scope, which can show pictures made of lines and curves and points, and can show pictures that move quite rapidly and any kind of animation that you can program. I'd like to introduce Professor Seymour Papert of MIT, who developed the programming language that we use for this kind of animation. That was Professor Marvin Minsky, who designed and built this machine. I'm going to show you how simple it is to write some pictures in the language that we've developed for children and other people.
So actually, this video is from the early 70s, and it was on a VHS tape in a storage container at the Minskys that only...
In Marvin's storage bin.
In Marvin's storage bin, and only recently got unearthed. But I find it particularly charming.
It was 1975.
Seymour describes logo, but never says the word logo. And the computer that Marvin's describing did have a bug that Danny fixed, and he actually wrote some of the control software for that.
And Danny wrote the best program that was a Ferris wheel with rocking seats.
But a point about this, which I think is really Marvin, Seymour needed a computer to do his research. Marvin said, okay, Seymour needs a computer, I'll build a computer. And so he just learned enough about using. The design of this kind of resembled some of the other work being done at the lab at the time, but it was essentially a lot of Marvin's tinkering. Research required a particular thing. If that thing didn't exist, Marvin just invented it.
Yes. The next thing that happened is we started another company. This one wasn't, for us, too successful because the little home computers came out and were in kind of competition. And I have a piece that I cut out where Marvin says this was inexpensive. It was only $5,000. So anyway, here is Marvin talking about
Well, the important idea was to let the child initiate activities because you want to find out or you want to exhibit what the child already can do and then modify or build on it. And in the traditional curriculum, you assume the children are blank slates and try to start from nothing. And so if anything conflicts with the skills they already have, they have to subtract rather than add to their abilities.
The company we started, Brian was also one of the founders, and it was called Logo Computer Systems. And we were trying to get Logo. Brian became the major programmer, and there were various wonderful versions. And Marvin and I backed off.
But in that video, one of the things is, we watched it several times while we were preparing this talk. Marvin is saying some things that you could hear the roots in Piaget. But interestingly enough, the roots in Piaget is, it's not Piaget according to Piaget, it's Piaget according to Seymour. And
yes, one of the things I talked to Brian about was when Marvin and Seymour first started collaborating, Marvin came from a Harvard tradition. He was an undergraduate at Harvard, and he worked with Skinner, and he was imbued with Skinnerian thinking. He built some apparatus, of course, for Skinner. But he wasn't very happy. He wasn't satisfied at all with Skinner's theory of learning. It didn't explain enough. It couldn't treat complicated things. And he was looking for a new foundation, and along came Seymour, who had been working with Piaget but had his own interpretations of children and thinking.
so in kind of wrapping up, yeah, I know.
The next, oh yeah, we're trying to keep to 5.
Yeah, we're going to try to keep
okay.
to 5.
The next thing, from the publication of his book, Society of Mind, almost through working on Emotion Machine, Marvin backed off of thinking about children and computers. Also, his kids had grown up. And his grandchildren were, not around enough, maybe, or something. Anyway, he again hooked up because of working with one laptop per child. And this was his contract with one laptop per child. But what he did do is he wrote 5 papers on education, which are
very Marvin and very good. So if you want to get a sense of Marvin in education, look up the OLPC papers.
Yeah,
So
that's it.
that's it. So I just wanted to say, as I started off by saying that my father said I'm going to the university that Marvin Minsky teaches at. That's great. Turns out he was completely right.
My story is titled Another Side of Marvin Minsky, but actually it's the same side as everyone else. So, okay. Marvin's creativity and spirit accomplished many wonderful things beyond his well-known contributions to AI and science. He repeatedly invented creative ways of bypassing misguided efforts of bureaucrats, and his empathy for those in need of help prompted him to engineer and implement novel solutions to their personal problems. I was both a witness and a beneficiary of this. It was 1956, shortly after the Air Force assigned me to Lincoln Laboratory at MIT, or MIT's Lincoln Laboratory, when I first met Marvin Minsky and John McCarthy. Minsky and McCarthy became my 2 closest friends. When I left the Air Force and got a job at BBN in 1958, I convinced them to hire both Minsky and McCarthy as consultants. A few years after that, I started my own company, Information International, Inc., and Minsky, McCarthy, Oliver Selfridge, and I were the board of directors. In 1965, Minsky, McCarthy, and I were at a meeting in Santa Monica, California, and John told Marvin and me that the MIT EE department had in essence told him to leave. It's one of the little tragedies of MIT that they didn't understand John McCarthy's desire to have people interact with computers, because people used to use computers by punching cards and waiting till the next day to find out what happened. Okay. So he'd arranged for an interview at Caltech. Marvin suggested that we drive John to Caltech to provide transportation for John and a bit of moral support. At Caltech, we waited till John emerged from his interview to tell us that, like MIT, Caltech wasn't interested. So John decided to try Stanford next and left for the airport. You all know what happened, and John had a fantastic career at Stanford. Then, as we were stranded in Pasadena with nothing to do, Marvin suggested that we simply phone an interesting Caltech person who might invite us to their home to talk. So I suggested Linus Pauling, whom I knew when I was a student there, but he was out of town. Then Marvin suggested Richard Feynman, who answered the phone and invited us to come over. We had a fantastic evening lasting past midnight. Feynman told us about his ideas on miniaturization, as in his paper, There's Plenty of Room at the Bottom, where he sort of predicted all of the microscopic technology that computers thrive on, okay? And he showed us a tiny electric motor that had won a prize that he'd offered for being able to fit into a cube 1/64 of an inch on edge. Marvin talked about AI and mentioned SIN, S-I-N, Jim Slagle's pioneering MIT doctorate thesis on symbolic integration. This piqued Feynman's interest, and he showed us about 50 pages covered with densely handwritten algebraic calculations. Feynman, Murray Gell-Mann, and a graduate student had each done the same algebra, but their end results were mutually incompatible. They concluded that humans just couldn't do that much algebra without a high probability of errors. Feynman asked, could something like Slagle's approach be used to assist someone doing massive amounts of algebra? Marvin and I quickly imagined such an interactive system and outlined the possibilities to Feynman. On the flight back to Boston, Marvin sketched out what was eventually implemented as Maxima, MATLAB, Mathematica, and so on. Let me just say one thing. The ideas of a computer doing algebra really started with John McCarthy and with the programming language Lisp. And various people had solved various problems. And the problem of integration was first solved by Slagle, and later on other people, like Joel Moses, improved upon it a great deal and made it much more capable. But what they didn't have in mind was the idea of a person being assisted in his doing algebra, as opposed to the idea the computer can solve that problem, okay? And that's what Feynman started us looking for. Okay, so Bill Martin, a graduate student then, led the Maxima programming effort, but at one point he ran out of steam. Marvin called me and told me about the situation and suggested that Bill simply needed a break for a few months. He suggested that III, my company, hire Bill to come to Los Angeles and work there on a different task. After a few months of intense work at III, the same thing happened. Marvin then suggested that I now send Bill back to the AI lab. I did, and Bill energetically plunged back into the task of leading the project to finish Maxima. At III, I discovered that Bill had actually completed like 99% of this whole difficult programming task on his project, and it only took me a couple of days to finish that last 1% because the work was really done, and it was a great success, by the way. Over time, Marvin repeatedly asked me to hire one person after another as a beneficial interruption of their work at the AI lab. We normally expected a return to the lab, grad students ready to complete a thesis or staff invigorated. One day, Bill Henneman, then a III programmer and self-taught mathematician, told me that he'd wanted to get a math degree from MIT. Yeah. But that MIT insisted he could not apply for admission as an undergraduate until he had a high school diploma. I brought the problem to Marvin, okay, who, as usual, came up with a brilliant solution. He quickly got Bill admitted as an MIT graduate student. It had never occurred to the MIT graduate school to even think of asking an applicant whether or not they had a high school diploma. Bill soon got his PhD at MIT, became a professor at BU, and was a key contributor to the creation of MATLAB, which is another one of these systems and a quite successful one. Okay. In 1968, Marvin and I worked together to create a III proposal to ARPA to develop and program real-time components of a computer robotic system. In particular, a robotic arm connected to a computer and a video input device. That was quite a problem in those days because no computer had enough memory to take one frame of video. So we had to do something where you could tell it X, Y, and it told you what it looked like at that point. So it was, those days, memory was $1 a byte. Okay. Instead of, now it's $1 a gigabyte. Okay. Okay. Marvin had slyly suggested to ARPA that MIT should do the project, and ARPA had agreed. When I found out, I felt excluded and was really annoyed. But Marvin had a bigger plan in mind. He also engineered keeping me involved by persuading the powers that be at MIT to appoint me, with no degree at all, as a visiting professor, which started me on an academic career. That's how I got to MIT. Years later, after spending a year at Caltech working with Feynman on physics, I told Marvin that I wanted to switch from computer science to physics. He put me in touch with his neighbor, just around the corner from Marvin's house, Larry Sulak, who was the head of physics at BU. I don't know what Marvin told Larry, but when I contacted him, he simply told me to get him some letters of recommendation, and in 3 weeks later, I was appointed a professor of physics at BU. So Marvin works magic in various directions. My first glimpse of that wonderfully human aspect of Marvin's creativity occurred a half a century ago, when he told me that Henry, his 4-year-old son at that time, didn't have a good friend. Since my son Michael was about the same age, Marvin described various interactions we could both engineer, despite the fact that our homes were quite far apart. I lived in Natick at that time, and Marvin lived in Brookline, so that they might become good friends. We did as Marvin suggested, and half a century later, they're still good friends. That's it. Okay. That's it.
Hello, I'm Tom Ashbrook with NPR and WBUR. If it's upsetting to have 2 radio guys on the stage materialized, please just close your eyes. In 1981, with my young bride, I had returned from 4 or 5 years in China and India. And one of my dearest, oldest friends, David Levitt, was working on his doctorate here in AI at MIT with Marvin. We came from the Midwest in a U-Haul and drove 1,000+ miles here. We were going to stay at David's house. I studied briefly math and physics at MIT when I drove that U-Haul 9.8 under the 9.6 bridge underpass on Mass Avenue. I'm going to introduce a video from David, who's in California and couldn't make it in about 30 seconds because we are time traveling here, as you may have noticed. I only wanted to say that I didn't know anything about Boston, except Paul Revere stories. And the first social event that I remember in the city was with David. We were staying in his graduate, dilapidated housing back here, graduate student thing. And he said, there's a party at Marvin Minsky's. Let's go. Margaret's having it. And we went. And I didn't know anything about this city, and I'm not a scientist. And we came into this room. And in this room, there was rockin' music going on, and we were ready to dance. But we came into the room, and it wasn't a dance like I'd ever seen. It was a kind of, there were lots of people, maybe all of you were there, I don't know how. And everybody was like doing some mechanical motion, and they all fit together. There must have been 30 people, and it was like a big, society of mind orgy going on. And you couldn't just do the funky chicken, you had to figure out how to get into this machine physically, and that was my introduction to Boston. Some people are foundational to understanding a place. I believe Marvin Minsky was foundational to understanding Boston. And in all the decades I've lived in and around Boston since that evening, thank you, Margaret and Gloria and Marvin, was absolutely fundamental to my sense of the power and beauty of thought and the mind and the society of mind. And this is my friend David Levitt, who's now in California, and he just wanted to say he studied AI. He got his doctorate here with Marvin. He's a scientist, inventor, musician. I feel like I'm at the Oscars because I know what the clock is doing here. He met Marvin in 1978. They began working on software that simulates how people improvise jazz, what goes through a musician's mind when he's asked to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star in the style of Fats Waller, let's say. David is now working, he's CEO of Pantomime Corporation. It's virtual reality. Marvin's student, Ivan Sutherland, of course, got that going, and David's got great things going at Pantomime. And he then and now, his love for Marvin, well, you'll see it.
It's an honor to be celebrating with you the life of Marvin Minsky, the smartest, most curious, most generous, most honest person I've ever known, most influential, and even more so, the most kind and generous person. You realize, how does the smartest person in the world or in the room not intimidate everybody? And the answer is, he had such a gift for humor that a student could never feel like he had asked a foolish question. A student asked, could there be a genetic basis rather than environment, a genetic basis to differences in intelligence? Marvin says, well, if there wasn't, then some lettuce would be as smart as people. He had books lying on every surface. I don't know if Tom has already described Marvin's living room. There's too much to describe in just one glimpse of Marvin's living room. For a while, he had books on every surface, and many of them had written in marker on the edge, read, an important instruction. And the biggest one had that marking too. It was the Oxford English Dictionary, read. And he knew a lot of, he knew principles of language, even more so than words. I asked him if a certain word that I knew was a noun could also be a verb. Marvin said confidently, you can verb anything. Who but Marvin could not only answer a more general question than the one you asked correctly and include an example and say it in only 4 words? It's pure Marvin. And something like that would come out of him every 3 minutes. And it was like being with a great comedian. It was like having tickets to the funniest guy. When he moved from the AI lab to the media lab, we knew the media lab was going to be exciting, but now we knew it was going to be the most exciting place. If someone was trying to describe something complicated in psychology or politics, or it said both sides, or neither side, or either side, Marvin would say, a dumbbell theory. And he'd do it in the kindest way. He never insulted anyone. He actually would draw a barbell and say, you've got an interesting theory that's got the problem broken up into 2 roughly equal parts and nothing much in between. That's actually the second simplest theory that you can have. The simplest theory you could have just has one part and one answer. God did it. But you can do better. And what you realize is that when you say both sides, you've signaled your brain to stop thinking. It's your way of telling the person you're talking to and yourself, there's no need to think any more deeply about this. And I think the past 38 years of my life, anytime that someone has said both sides, either side, neither side, a part of my brain has woken up and said, that's not, that dumbbell theory probably isn't the best description or the last description we need to make of that situation and that problem. And I think for hundreds and thousands of people who've been around Marvin, we've all become smarter by following the principles that Marvin taught us. And we've all become funnier and better improvisers. Marvin was the most amazing improviser, not just at the keyboard where he could improvise a few, but in the lecture hall where he would carefully not make complete notes or any notes for a lecture. And the first lecture I saw Marvin give, he seemed to wander and was talking about evolution and children's learning. And by the end of it, he had drawn a tree, a palm tree, and he wound up saying, I'm up at the top of this tree, and if you're not having as much fun as I am, you might as well consider changing fields. Because he created the most exciting mental playground out of the universe that any of us has ever seen. We never wanted to leave it. We haven't left it. It's still here. The fields that his students like Sutherland, who created computer graphics and simulation, and what the field that I'm in, now known as virtual reality, that whole universe that Marvin created is still here. And it's glorious, and he's immortal, and he will never leave us. And thank you. Thank you, Marvin. Thanks to everyone who had Marvin in our lives. Thank you, Gloria, for making that amazing home the home to so many of us students. Thank you.
I think of immortality in terms of, for myself, it's the Society of Scientists, because I feel that I'm doing a little of what Piaget wanted and a lot of what McCulloch wanted to do, and there's some of Carol Williams in me and some of Andy Gleason, and I have two students who I think are inheriting McCulloch. They've never met McCulloch, but through me so there's this big network of ideas, and it keeps growing as long as science grows.
Is there some Watson Crick in you too?
There's a little Crick.
There's a little Crick.
I love.
All right. So my name is Ed Boyden. I direct a neurotechnology group here at the Media Lab. And just wanted to talk maybe through three very short stories about Marvin and how I think he's played a big role in brain science, which is sort of the distant twin of all the AI we've been talking about. So of course, Marvin had his origins in brain science, doing a PhD on trying to make neural models, and afterwards developing a microscope, which to this very day, if you wander through any neuroscience department, you'll find several of them. One of the most powerful tools still available in brain science. I was an undergraduate studying physics at the Media Lab and doing some research here. And a couple of us students got the idea to invite Marvin and also Jerry Lettvin, the neurophysiologist, to have a little bit of a debate. And what really struck out was just how generous Marvin was with his time. Here he was, we were probably asking him questions that he was quite bored with, answering the 5,000th time. I'm joking, nothing would ever bore Marvin. And yet there we were, going late into the night, discussing whether the brain was solvable and how you'd go about it. And the interaction that began that day, I very much treasured over the past decades. When I got to MIT later as faculty, I had many interactions with Marvin as well, and he always would, in his own powerful, sometimes blunt, as you've heard already, but always generous and empathetic way, would share his thoughts. And I still remember one small group setting where a couple of us were chatting about some interesting developments in AI and neuroscience, and I thought I had something helpful to say. And Marvin says something to the effect, well, I really like Ed as a person, but do I have to listen to him talk about neuroscience? And, but in that, the way that sort of just described how much he balanced sort of the awe of the mind, and also let's stay on task. The mission is to understand intelligence at its very core. Don't settle for less. One last sort of series of thoughts is, throughout all these years, it always has been amazing to just interact with Marvin about anything that came to his mind. And I remember at countless lunches or dinners or other events, he would come up and just start talking about something like, do you think more life has been spent watching sports versus all the life lost in war? And I'm like, whoa, that's, and we get into a discussion about it. Or another example was when he decided that we would solve all of humanity's problems if humans could be engineered to be 8 inches tall. And I never asked him why 8, why not 9, why not 7, but he had all sorts of very thoughtful ideas about energy, and we could solve a lot of problems if we just were a lot smaller. And so I think that's what struck me most about Marvin, was just how almost anything could be a source of inspiration. And that's what I really regard Marvin as having played a role in my own life, as being very inspiring for getting a physicist trying to figure out a path in life and to confront one of the biggest challenges of all time, the mind. So thank you.
Ruth.